Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yuval Bar-Or. I'm here to talk about financial literacy, money matters. Paying for your wedding and planning for your future may appear to be somewhat separate topics, but they are related. Some of the same skills are required for both. In particular, the planning element is crucial. You need to think about budgeting. You need to think about communicating with each other. You need to think about making decisions together. So I'd like to take a few minutes and talk about each of those items. Before I do that, as a few people are still taking their seats, let me provide a reminder here. Available to you is a one-page handout. This has two purposes. One, to summarize what I'm going to talk about, and two, to make sure I keep myself on track, because usually I don't talk for 20 minutes. I talk for an hour to 3 hours. And so by having some of those notes in front of me, it'll help me to make sure that I'm speaking very succinctly. So I mentioned already three items I'd like to focus on today are the budgeting, the communicating, and the deciding factors, and then we'll go on and talk a little bit more about other things such as estate planning and longer-term planning. Budgeting, I assume people are familiar with the term. When we talk about a budget, we're talking about the process of thinking about various sources of income, various sources of savings, and subtracting from that income any expenditures that may be relevant. So we can apply the concept of a budget in a number of different settings. In the planning your wedding setting, we're talking about a particular project, the wedding arrangements, and you want to think about the different sources of savings in order to fund that wedding, and then the very specific wedding expenditures. And we have a number of different vendors here today. You look around the room, you need to budget for all of these wonderful services. In the broader topic or the broader context of planning for your future together, we're not talking about a one-year plan, we're talking about a 30, 40, 50-year plan. Again, there you need to think about annual earnings, subtract from that your annual expenditures. That gives you a sense of how much money you're able to make available as disposable income and for saving and investing. In the context of planning for that longer-term enterprise, that 30, 40, 50-year horizon, if in a given year you make less than you expend, you need to somehow finance that. Right? And the worst case scenario is when that shortfall ends up on your credit card bill, because you're going to pay significant interest charges on that. If you're unable to make ends meet, you're going to burden yourself longer term with significant expenditures that will then weigh you down. Instead of having the dream wedding followed by the dream honeymoon followed by the dream life, you may end up spending several years just paying off wedding expenditures. So important to budget, plan ahead, and that really leads me to the next big concept, which is proactivity. So that's a theme that's going to run through everything I'm going to talk about today. Planning is all about thinking about things ahead of time, not reacting, but being proactive. So we've talked about the budgeting element. So following budgeting, we talk about communication. What is the most common cause of relationship disagreements? This is in every magazine, exactly every report, every poll. Money matters. So it behooves us, knowing that in advance, to preempt, to act before the crisis situation happens, to plan before the crisis situation happens, and to make sure that we're on top of things. How do we do that? By communicating with each other. Keeping in mind that we are now forming a union. There are going to be two of us now making decisions instead of just one. And we very likely come from very different backgrounds, very different perspectives about money, very different cultures about money. In some families, money is a dirty subject. You're not allowed to talk about it. In other cases, there are people who prefer to be spenders, and others prefer to be savers. So it's important to understand yourself and to give your spouse, your partner, an opportunity to express themselves as well. You need to respect where they're coming from. You need to understand where they're coming from. Another important consideration is the money discussion. You need to have regular, routine conversations about money. That's very important, again, for preemption purposes. But there's another reason you want to have those regular, routine discussions, hopefully as frequent as on a weekly basis. You want to get comfortable with each other talking about money. You don't want the money conversation to be the crisis discussion that suddenly comes up because no one's thought about it. So you want to get comfortable over a glass of wine every week, in the jacuzzi, whatever works for you. You have that discussion. It's light, it's casual, you get caught up, It's perfectly fine if one of you is taking the lead on money-making decisions. But you both have to agree to those decisions. You have to be involved, at least at some level, to understand. And again, all that requires communication. So we've now talked about budgeting and communication. The third item has to do with deciding, right? And it may seem, on the face of it, decision-making may seem very simple, but in fact, it's far from it. Decision-making is loaded with psychological issues and challenges. We don't often think about them, but in fact, we encounter them all the time, whether we're consciously aware of them or not. And so I've outlined on that sheet that's been handed out a listing. It's not meant to be scientifically rigorous, but it's a listing of decision-making steps. And I'll just read those out quickly. You want to identify your goals, your aspirations, effectively your mission, whether it's planning the wedding or it's living together. You want to collect all the relevant information. You want objective information, quantifiable information, concrete information. Not what you think might be the right number for a mortgage you can afford or some other big decision, but what you know is the right number because you've looked at the numbers. You've sought those numbers from professionals. You then want to list the different steps that will get you from where you are today to those goals. If it's a simple decision, you may only have one step. But if it's a complex decision, investing for retirement, things with a long-term horizon often are more complex, you need to be aware of the different tactical steps that will get you from where you are today to where you want to be. You also need to consider throughout the process various risks. What are the risks that you're going to encounter? What's going to threaten your wedding plans or your living together plans for the next 30 to 50 years? You need to think about how to mitigate those risks, how to deal with each of those risks if and when they do occur. Almost finally, you need to make a decision. So if all the earlier steps I've just described get you to identifying 3 different paths forward, choice X, choice Y, and choice Z, you may at that point be in position to say, I want to go down path X. But you haven't actually made the decision yet. You haven't made the decision until you've gone down path X. Right? You actually have to do it. Procrastinators can get all the way to that second last point. They think they've decided because they're in their mind, they're saying, oh yeah, I'm going to do that. But they don't actually do it. They don't finalize it. You can never really move on. I'll share with you a somewhat tragic example. There's a reason why I want to bring that up, because it's important to hear these lessons early when you still have an opportunity to plan. Couple, both professionals, in fact, both physicians, who were on their second marriages in each case. So they had very complex estate planning challenges with children from prior marriages. And they were told by an estate planning attorney and financial advisor that they needed to make sure that all their paperwork was in order. Wills, trusts, financial power of attorney, medical power of attorney. And finally they got around to having those documents drafted and were then killed in a car accident. Tragic story on a number of levels. Obviously the human tragedy is difficult even to comprehend. They had not signed the documents. The documents remained on their desks unassigned for months. So that not only did their children have to deal with a human tragedy, they also had to deal with utter confusion at the worst possible time of how to sort through all of these assets, which no longer had the certainty that that estate planning paperwork provides us with. So, word of caution there. So we've now talked about some of the skills that I hope everyone is thinking about developing: the budgeting, the communicating, and the deciding, and again, keeping in mind that a decision is not made until you've taken action. Next, a few quick words about funding the wedding. The money for the wedding is not going to appear out of nowhere. So you need to take some preemptive action. You need to think about it. And everybody here has obviously done that, so that's a good thing. You need to go through the process we've just described of budgeting, communicating, looking through the numbers, getting a good sense of what's real. It's advisable to set up a joint savings account. The process I've just described, in particular the budget, helps you to understand how much you're going to need and where those funds are going to come from and when they're going to arrive. Is there money set aside from parents? Are you going to need every month or 2 weeks to have money taken out of your paycheck and to make sure it goes into that savings account? When exactly will the funds be available through a job or through other sources? If you're borrowing, you need to make sure that you're borrowing at an interest rate that's going to be feasible, that's going to be supportable, that's not going to create a drain on your finances once you're married. So funding the wedding is crucially important, and again, as echoing many of the comments that were made by prior speakers, do things well in advance. 6 months, 12 months. The longer you give yourself, the more ability you have to come up with plans B and C in case other things fall through. And the more peace of mind you have that you're going to be ready. You're not going to lose sleep during the process. Okay, I'll say a few words now about combining households from the financial perspective. Keller is going to follow me. She's going to talk about the mortgage issues that come into coming together and actually setting up a household together. She will also, I believe, echo some of my comments about the importance of tax considerations when you're going through all of those decisions. So from my perspective, I'm going to go back to the estate planning message. When you get married, you're creating a union. There's a legal meaning to that. There are also tax efficiency issues, and there are also a number of asset protection considerations that come into play. So you need to think about not just the joint savings account, but do we combine our checking accounts? Do we combine various other financial accounts? Do we list ourselves as joint owners on other real estate that may exist? There are some asset types that you cannot become a joint owner on, but you can become a beneficiary of. And so it's important to go through the thought process of, okay, now we're married, do we need to fill in the paperwork to make sure that we're appropriately set up as the beneficiaries to avoid tax issues, to avoid probate issues, and so on. Finally, I want to talk about the longer-term planning, so add a little more detail. I mentioned earlier that I typically will spend an hour to 3 hours talking about these topics, so I feel highly constrained here. So the obvious observation from that is that there's no way I can impart to you everything I wish I could. Having said that, obviously, myself, Tracy, and Jacob are here to answer any questions you may have. So I just want to leave you with a few high-level thoughts to sort of hopefully set you on your way in the right direction. The name of the game when you're thinking long-term when it comes to finance is to a great extent about accumulating assets. You want to accumulate as many different types of assets as you can. Are there any business owners in the crowd? I'm sure that we have some, right? You know that you pour your heart and soul into your business. Several years in, you're to be congratulated because the business is successful. An observation is that most of your wealth is tied up in that business because you pour everything into that business. As more money is made available, you want to expand, you want to refine the business, and so everything goes back into it, which means that you end up with one big asset, which is a great thing, but it's precarious if you compare it to having multiple assets. So I like to use the analogy of, in our minds, saving for the long term, building up that assets. Every asset is represented by a pillar. Think about a beautiful Greek column made of solid marble. And now think about surrounding yourself with as many of these pillars as possible. I refer to that concept as the pillars of wealth. Those pillars are there to support you in retirement, to support your household for whatever financial needs may arise. So you want to build up as many different pillars as possible. If you're a business person, you have one big pillar, great, but you want to reduce the risks to losing all of that concentrated wealth. So you want to, over time, siphon off some of that value into other pillars, build up other pillars. Pillars can come in the form of owning property. It could be your own residence. They can be an investment property. They come in the form of 401k plans, 403bs, IRAs. They can be collectibles if you're an art collector, a coin collector, and so on. So there are lots of different types of pillars or assets that you can surround yourself with, that you can work building, and you should. If you think about that analogy, it will help you to stay focused on what you want your life to look like 20 or 30 years from now. You want to be surrounded by those pillars. Now, to protect those pillars, we have a number of techniques available. Insurance, liability insurance, disability insurance, life insurance, and so on. Having those in place is like protecting the foundations of your pillars, making sure that those pillars don't deteriorate over time, making sure that they're there for you. You could put another layer, imagine putting a huge big dome over that entire structure now, through the estate planning process. Put various assets in a trust, now they're protected from creditors, they're protected from various other sources of danger. So now we have that slightly more refined analogy to work towards. Final words, hopefully words of wisdom. Time can be your best friend, but it can also be your worst enemy. So when it comes to money matters, doing things well in advance is always a good idea. If you do that, time is your best friend. We can't get into the technical reasons for that because we don't have time, but it allows you to save over a longer period of time, compound money over a longer period of time. It's always better to do. On the other hand, time can be and will be your worst enemy if you leave things to the last minute. If you procrastinate, time is going to be breathing down your neck consistently. I wish everyone well, and of course we'll be here to answer any questions if any of those come up.